Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, brought to you and presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I introduce to you Brother Chris Ludke.
This is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to explore Masonry under the Reich, Part 4. Here we're going to be looking into first-hand accounts of what it was like for Masons in the camps. And of course, we're dealing with different kinds of camps. We're going to be exploring Masons who were held as political prisoners, which is going to be a much worse experience, a very different experience compared to those that were POWs, because there are certain things you have to keep in mind. If they are political prisoners, their tie to the lodge may well have been known. Whereas if you're a POW and you're caught without any Masonic paraphernalia or any materials that connect you to a lodge, the Germans would have no idea. This will not be an exhaustive list of lodge activities in the camps. That's probably impossible. We have so many primary sources from some areas, but not from others, and we don't have really exhaustive lists. That being said, we do have a lot of information. Instead, we're looking at a glimpse of what we know about these activities and the dramatic differences that we see based on their reasons for imprisonment. The length of this episode is necessary to illustrate the variety of camp experiences, although it does not illustrate life in the death camps, because we don't get information coming out of them, and that life in the death camps tends to be short, horrific, and basically is exactly what you would expect, although the death camps don't come in line until 1941-42, really the period of the final solution. Camp life can vary wildly, depending on the nature of the camp, the front, your rank, as well as your ethnicity. Some experiences are much better than others. For example, an African-American POW would have a much worse experience than, for example, a white American POW. But also, it depends on the front. The Japanese massively mistreat American POWs. The Germans treat American, English, and French POWs relatively well, but they horrifically mistreat the Russians. And by the way, the Russians do the same thing to the Germans. They're both starving each other. The Russians will take German POWs and basically disappear them for 5 years before releasing them in Russia. So it's a pretty horrific situation. And remember those ties to Masonry. When they are known, things are a little different. Plus, the Masons that we look at in the political prisoner camp are going to be people who are involved in resistance activities in the first place. And so their experience is going to be a little different. In terms of sources, I'm going to be looking at the Bennett thesis, the Thomas dissertation, which we've been dealing with throughout the series. I'm going to be looking at Jeff Allen's Stalag Masons, looking at camp experience, A.R. Hurwitz, Craftsmen in Captivity, Masonic Activities of Prisoners of War, and Alexander Herbert, A Light in the Darkness, this brilliant book. It's very short. It's available on Amazon. All about the Lodge Liberat Shari, which we will be discussing right out of the gate here. This is Part 4 of Masonry under the Reich, the Craft Imprisoned. So we're going to start with the craft in the camps, looking at the Lodge Liberat Shari, or the Cherished Liberty Lodge in French. Well, in English, translating from the French. Now, bear with me because the names are going to be tricky. These are Belgian names, French names, so my pronunciation is not going to be great. On November 15th of 1943, 7 Belgian Freemasons and resistance fighters founded Masonic Lodge Lodge Liberat Shari inside Hut 6 of Emsland Lager 7, which is one of these political prisoner camps. The name of the lodge was derived from La Marseillaise, the great song of France. The original 7 Freemasons who found the lodge or members of the lodge, are Paul Hansen, Luc Sommerhausen, Jean de Cheriver, Jean Sug, Henri Story, Amédée Miclot, Franz Rocha, Guy Hanekart, and they will later initiate, pass, and raise Brother Ferdinand Erau, another Belgian. Now, according to Franz Burdo, who's a former prisoner at Esterwegen's Hut 6, the founding members of Lodge Liberat Chari were Rochot, Schug, Hanekart, Hansen, Sommerhausen, de Geldry, and Miclot. Now, the last two of them, de Cheveret and M. Story, arrived well after the establishment of the lodge and were not founding members, but they were members. Paul Hansen will be the elected master. And the brethren met for lodge work in Hut 6, generally around a table which was otherwise used for cartridge sorting. A Catholic priest stood watch so that brethren could hold their meetings and protect their secrecy. Hut 6 was used for foreign Nock und Nebel, or night and fog prisoners, which I want to get into a little bit before we move on too far. Now, the night and fog prisoners are basically political prisoners. And effectively, there is a directive that goes out, and this is referring to activities focused in Belgium, France, Luxembourg, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands. And basically what it lays out is how they will handle these prisoners. What they're going to do is they're going to arrest them. The Gestapo, more specifically, is going to arrest these people. And then an effective, and I'm quoting from Himmler, an effective and lasting deterrent can be achieved only by the death penalty or by taking measures which will leave the family and population uncertain as to the fate of the offender. Deportation to Germany serves this purpose. And this is what's happening to the people in this camp, this night and fog camp. 1 week later, Field Marshal Keitel issues his interpretation in accordance with this directive, stating, quote, "Efficient and enduring intimidation can only be achieved either by capital punishment or by measures by which relatives of the criminals do not know the fate of the criminal. The prisoners are in future to be transported to Germany secretly, and further treatment of the offenders will take place here. These measures will have a deterrent effect because A, the prisoners will vanish without a trace, B, no information may be given of their whereabouts or their fate." This program would become known as Night and Fog, or the Night and Fog Decree. As its victims appear to vanish into thin air, the overall goal is to keep the occupied territories pacified by fear without directly implicating Germany in criminal conduct or treaty violations. It's estimated that over 7,000 people from France alone will be arrested, deported, tortured, imprisoned, and or executed in the 3 years between 1941 and 44. So it's a pretty big program, and that's what we're dealing with. The members of this lodge are night and fog prisoners. They've been taken from their families, from anyone that they know, intentionally deported, no information is coming back, everyone assumes that they're going to their death. And in most cases, that is exactly what happens, but I don't want to give you too many spoilers. Now, these camps were a group of 15 prison camps established on the Netherlands border on the German side, with central administration in Papenburg. Now, Sommerhausen will describe Erau's initiation as just a simple ceremony. And this gives us an idea of what things look like within the function of this lodge. Remember, they're around a table, and you're saying they're going, well, how would that work? Well, as long as you have your officers and the appropriate symbol, you can work. Presumably a Bible might be available or some other volume of sacred law is appropriate, but even if it's not, we know historically there have been lodges that have operated without. And that's okay under certain circumstances. I'm thinking of the American Revolutionary period or other times through history. So, describing Arau's initiation. These ceremonies and the maintenance of the secrecy of which they asked community of Catholic priests for assistance, quote, with their prayers, took place at one of the tables after a very highly simplified ritual whose individual components were, however, explained to the initiate. So you can imagine what's happening here. They're going through a very simple form of initiation, but all the explanations are still there. That from now on, he could participate in the work of the lodge. So, an entered apprentice, a first-degree Mason, is allowed to participate in the lodge by simply going through the initiation. More than 100 prisoners were in Hut 6 and locked up nearly around the clock, allowed to leave only for a half-hour walk per day and then under supervision. During the day, half the camp had to sort cartridges and radio parts. The prisoners in the other half were forced to work under dreadful conditions in the surrounding peat bogs. Peat bogs are sort of dried swamps, really bad circumstances, but often the peat is used as a heat source. It can be turned into fuel, but these are going to be pretty rough situations. The nutrition is so miserable that prisoners lost on average 4 kilograms or 8.8 pounds of body weight every month. Remember, they're not really meant to survive. It's not a death camp, but it's sure as heck not trying to keep them alive. They don't want them going back. So there's a lot of problems here. After the first ritual meeting with the admission of the new brother, further meetings were thematically prepared. One was dedicated to the symbol of the great architect of the universe, another to the future of Belgium, and a further one to quote the position of women in Freemasonry. You can imagine that they're basically holding lectures. And by the way, we see the same thing happening, this idea of lectures and distracting people from their day-to-day existence within these camps. We see the same thing amongst the Jewish inmates at Terezin, where they develop a giant artistic outflowing, putting on operas, dances, lectures, artistic exhibitions, and the like. And there's something about that, something about being distracted that takes your mind away from the fact that you're probably going to die in this camp, and it gives you a little hope. It gives you a reason to live one more day. Sometimes in the camp, that desire to live one more day, to hear that lecture, to see those men, could be enough to get you through the war. Now, only 2 of the gentlemen will survive. Sommerhausen and Arau survived detention, and the lodge stopped working at the beginning of 1944. Now, there will be an entire debate on this regarding whether or not this should become a lodge in the Grand Lodge of Belgium. And this debate will go on for quite some time. The problem is, it's technically a clandestine lodge. It doesn't operate under a warrant. They haven't sought permission, but yet they couldn't have. The circumstances wouldn't have allowed it. And so we run into these issues, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Let's look at some of these members. The master, Paul Hansen, was moved ultimately from the camp and died in the rubble of his prison during an Allied air bombardment on Essen on March 26, 1944. Franz Rochat, a professor, pharmacist, and director of a pharmaceutical laboratory, who also worked in the underground press and the resistance publication Voice of the Belgians, was arrested in February of 42 and then moved to another camp where he dies on 6 April 1945, only a month before the end of the war. By the way, really common experience, because they're moving these prisoners on a regular basis, trying to keep them ahead of the Allies, And so you have death marches, but also there are times where the guards simply shoot the gentlemen or the prisoners more broadly who simply can't make the walk. Or they're irritating. The rules break down as the war progresses. Jean Sugue cooperated with Rochat in the underground press. He translated German and Swiss texts and contributed to clandestine publications. And there's a number of them that he will go ahead and contribute to. He will die in a concentration camp on 8 February 1945. Miclot was a high school teacher. He would be last seen in detention on the same date as Sugue, 8 February 1945. This usually means they've been sent to a death camp. Jean Schrijver, Schrijver, I apologize for the pronunciation, he was a colonel in the Belgian army. He's arrested in 1943 on charges of espionage and possession of arms and dies again in February of 1945. Henri Story was a member of a lodge in Ghent, and he will die on 5 December 1944. Sommerhausen, who's a journalist, is arrested in 1943 in Brussels. He belongs to the lodge. He was deputy secretary of the Grand Orient of Belgium. And interestingly, he is going to be one of the survivors. Erau, an assessor at the audit office, and the brother who went through initiation within the lodge, and reserve officer with the infantry, was arrested in 1942 as member of the Secret Army, a resistance group. He escaped and was finally arrested in 1943. Hanekart is a lawyer and leader of Le Vox de Belgique, the Voice of Belgium. He was also a member of the Lodge number 3, Les Amas Philanthropes. The survivors, Erau and Sommerhausen, met again in 1944 at another concentration camp and remained inseparable from then on. In the spring of 45, they were involved in death marches, and although Erau was 1.84 meters tall, give or take a little under 6 foot, he weighed only 32 kilograms or 70 pounds on 21 May 1945 when he's in the hospital, specifically St. Pierre Hospital in Brussels. It gives you an idea of how rough the situation is. 70 pounds, he didn't have much longer to live. So the timing was good. You could argue luck was on his side. In August of 45, Sommerhausen sent a detailed report to the Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Belgium, in which he delineated the history of the Lodge Libéral Chari. And this will lead to a great deal of argument. Whether or not this is a regular lodge, how do they memorialize it? Because what's happening is remarkable. And by the way, we have evidence that there were probably other lodges, but they may not have kept the same records. It's the story of history. Whoever writes the records gets their history remembered. Sommerhausen will die in 1982 at the age of 79. The last eyewitness, Erau, dies at age 83 in 1997. There will be a monument built, there will be memorials, and eventually the lodge will be accepted by the Grand Lodge of Belgium, although well after the events that happen in the camp. And the thing to keep in mind as we go through this material, as we look at these political prisoners, is most of them were destined to die. They were not intended to survive the war. In fact, most of this information I'm drawing from Alexander Herbert's A Light in the Darkness. So when they go into these camps, they will take certain risks. And the interesting thing is the role of the Catholic priests, who will basically stand guard while the Masons use the table. And the Masons will do the same thing for them. These are pragmatic partnerships that come up in the camps all the time. Now I want to move from the Night and Fog prisoners, these Belgian POWs, or primarily Belgian POWs, to Allied POWs in the camps. When we talk about these concentration camps, or the POW camps, you have to keep in mind that the camp system throughout Germany operates based on who you are. So if you're a POW from Russia, you're going to a different camp than a POW from the United States. If you are a political prisoner, you're going to a different camp yet. And if you are Jewish, etc., you will go to a different camp. Sometimes these camps will have multiple sections. And so one section will be political prisoners, another section will be POWs, another section. It's complicated. When I use the term concentration camp, it's a broad term. It's basically referring to everything that isn't exactly a death camp. Those are, of course, different situations. Now, during the Second World War, Masons from across Europe were sent to concentration camps, and many, well, all, if they were known, wore the inverted red triangle, denoting that they were political prisoners. If you were a POW and you were captured and they knew you were a Mason, you would probably be treated as a political prisoner. Although accurate numbers are very difficult to verify, it's estimated that around 80,000 total Freemasons perished in concentration camps between 1933 and 1945. I've seen numbers between 80,000 and 200,000. Most of them are not German Freemasons because we've covered that situation. That's a whole different situation, but these are Freemasons from the Balkans, from France, and elsewhere throughout continental Europe, as far east as Russia, as far west as Spain. And so they're rounding these people up, they're putting them into camps. And there are a number of commonalities that exist in the recollection of those who are unfortunate enough to be captured. The first being, and because of age, not unexpectedly, a lack of past masters entering captivity. Now we're focusing here primarily on POWs, but we will see other forms of prisoner here. But because the average POW is going to be a member of the military and probably between the ages of 18 and 25, you're going to see very few past masters, very few ritualists coming in, and this is not terribly surprising. As an example, at Stalag 383, from among 82 captive Masons, 23 from the United Grand Lodge of England, 4 from the Grand Lodge of Ireland, 29 from the Grand Lodge of Scotland, 24 from who are Australian, and 4 others, including one unnamed New Zealander. Only one brother happened to be a past master. It is not surprising, therefore, that much of the activity that you're going to see in the camps revolves around them trying to reproduce the ritual from memory. It's not stated in the literature whether or not active duty servicemen were advised not to carry evidence of Masonic association, but only one brother, an H. Walwork, entered captivity with a copy of a cipher or book of ritual. Now, you will notice that many of these accounts I'm looking at are looking at British or otherwise Commonwealth POWs. That's because we don't have a lot of information at present on American POWs in the camps who happen to be Masons, etc. So keep that in mind. Secondly, you run into an issue where we have people coming in, and as we will see, they often don't know that there are other Masons in the camp. Everyone's trying to keep it quiet because you don't want to add fuel to the fire. You don't want to say, hey, by the way, I'm a POW. I was trying to bomb your city, and I happen to be a Freemason. It's up there with trying to hide the fact that you might be Jewish or any other persecuted group within Germany. Now, the second point is that Masonic association could not be constituted as lodges as they were not warranted. Therefore, neither could they work. So, in theory, these lodges, these temporary lodges that form, can't actually work because they don't have dispensation, they don't have warrants and charters, and so they can't do anything. But of course, they'll work around that because sometimes Masonry is more important than the bureaucracy. Secrecy was practiced to an extreme degree, as we could well understand. Potential brethren were rigorously proved before being allowed entry to the lodge. Typically, this is going to be through oral tests. They aren't carrying their membership card. So you're going to have to prove that you know your material, that you know Freemasonry, in order to belong to one of these groups. In fact, Brother Shelby Boothroyd spent 18 months in one of these camps, OFLAG 7B, without being aware of the extensive Masonic activity that was going on there. So it's really common. Oftentimes, these groups will stick to themselves. They don't want anyone else really knowing what's going on. They may have someone volunteering as a lookout, but they're not going to call them a Tyler. They're going to cover the materials in a way that kind of hides it. Everything's coded, which, as Masons, we're used to. So let's start with OFLAG 8F, which is in Czechoslovakia. So by 1944, some 40 brethren transferred from an Italian camp were being held at this OFLAG 8F and were holding a regular society of improvement, with the word society obviously used as a blind. This is a craftsman's club. This is a Masonic lodge or operating thereas. But they don't want to use that term because if it's overheard, that's a problem. And they're always concerned about bugs and spies and other people within the camp, because obviously you're happy to sell someone out if it means you're going to get better accommodations or more food or whatever else. Initially, their activity consisted of the opening and closing under the leadership of Brother Cliff Downing, one of the few past masters in the camp. The senior chaplain of the camp was also a member of the craft and allowed the brethren the use of the chapel for their meetings, ostensibly to listen to theological lectures. And of course, as we know, this is going to be important. They're going to make it look like a discussion. When you think about what happens in a Masonic lodge, that can cover a lot. After a while, they met in a small room that could be only accessed through another room where Indian prisoners rehearsed their, quote, noisy and incomprehensible dramas, but the noise would have been a cover. The German guards wouldn't have heard what was going on beyond the Indian prisoners, and here Indian prisoners referring to India, because of course members of the British Commonwealth are fighting in World War II alongside the British. Minutes of all meetings were kept and brought back to the United Kingdom after the war, but they were often so cryptic, not surprisingly, obviously to confuse the guards, that often the secretaries themselves had difficulty deciphering their own work after the war. The whole camp, all of OFLAG 8F, will be moved to OFLAG 79 near Brunswick in May of 1944. Now, the reason we're seeing a lot of movement in 44 is 43, the Germans have come into Italy. Italy has flipped sides, and so they're going to pull their prisoners out. They're going to move them to Czechoslovakia. As the Russians are moving in from the east, they're going to move them again into Germany, in this case, to Brunswick, Germany. And so as the war closes in on Germany, they're pulling those prisoners in from other territories. They don't want them freed. They want to keep a hold on them because it gives them a bit of a trump card. So we move to OFLAG 79. The camp was situated between a Luftwaffe operational airfield and aircraft engine factory. So not surprisingly, the inmates became very interested in the activities of the United States 8th Air Force because they are day bombing on a regular basis, and the British, of course, are doing the same at night. It was here that the lodge really cemented itself. The same people from OFLAG 8 are showing up here in Brunswick. But it really cements itself with a membership of about 70 brethren from England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, India, South Africa, and the United States. Remember that unity that the Nazis were so concerned with? We're seeing it right here. The acceptance. Because the South African soldiers could be black or they could be white. The Indian soldiers are going to be, well, Indian. They don't look like everyone else. You're going to see minority groups. You're going to see different ethnicities. And it's really an illustration of what the Nazis were so concerned about in episodes 1 and 2. Initially, they met in the cellars of the camp, which also served as air raid shelters. And when the electricity went out, they had to resort to margarine oil lamps. For those of you in Wisconsin, you will be amused by the fact that butter doesn't burn real well, but margarine does, especially when it's colored pink and illegal in the state. It was at one time. I digress. After one air raid, Brother Selby Boothroyd records sardonically that rough ashlars and the emblems of mortality were plentiful. Working tools carved from wooden beds and watercolor tracing boards the size of postcards were invariably small enough so that they could be immediately hidden in coat pockets should they be interrupted by the guards. And you can imagine that they would have no idea how the guards would react. Maybe they're sympathetic, maybe they don't care and they're apathetic, maybe they're going to use this as a way to get a promotion or get out of the camp or whatever else. In fact, it was common practice in all camps in both Europe and the Far East to fashion your own materials. They will not, however, make an attempt to fashion aprons. You can imagine why. Of all the things that you would have, that would be the hardest to hide. You don't want to have someone walk in and see all these aprons and go, hey, what's going on? This seems to be something that stands out. The brethren did endeavor to attend their regular meetings in the best clothes that they possess. This could mean as simple as cleaning up the uniform that they're given. It could be that they have some other materials in the POW camps. They may still have their military uniforms that they may be allowed to wear. While the fact that they had two Tylers who would raise the shout, "Goon up," did not arouse the guard's suspicion. This is really common. To have lookouts at the camps, to basically yell out, hey, there's a German coming. In this case, goon up would be the same thing. And this wouldn't arouse suspicion. It's common. And this would happen wherever the guards went, anywhere in the camp, not just around these meetings. If the guard did enter, they would simply find a group of earnest young men listening to a discourse on some subject totally divorced from Freemasonry. This is something that they would have practiced. We're going to move into this discussion if anyone shows up. As air raids increased towards the culmination of the war, regular meetings became impossible. Eventually, the Lodge Regalia was distributed amongst the brethren and could be found in various Masonic museums across the globe. On 10 April 1945, they met for the last time, and it was up to Brother Selby Boothroyd as junior warden to have the final word. Quote, "And it is closed accordingly until time or circumstance shall bring 7 or more of us together again, of which meeting every brother shall have notice at his last address." Kind of amusing, because that would be the camp. It's his way of saying, we're done. I don't intend to see you all again. You're all great people, but I really don't want to be in your presence because it probably means something horrible has happened again. The Brunswick Lodge of Improvement will never meet again because of the end of the war, not because of horrific tragedy in this case. So let's move to O-Flag 7D. This is again in Germany, in Tippmoning. And this camp is situated in an old hunting lodge, basically, previously owned by the Prince Bishop of Salzburg. In the courtyard was a marble trough with a bas-relief depicting the pillars, the square, and the rule dating back to 1781. The 3 Masonic brethren who had transferred from Laufen were by chance all put in the same room. Conversation naturally led them to identify each other, and they set about identifying other brethren in the camp. Within 3 months, they had enough to consider a meeting and approached the senior British officer, a man by the name of Colonel Gamble, for permission to use the camp library for the purpose. By the way, the POWs have a lot of control, especially if you happen to be American or British, as long as you don't try to leave the camp. But again, that changes camp to camp. The colonel demanded to know the purpose of the intended meeting. Terrifying moment. And when this was disclosed, he gave his permission on the condition that he could, too, attend. Another member of the craft had been found. They met on a weekly basis with a membership of about 20. They included 2 past masters and a number of chaplains. While they realized that they were acting without a warrant, They felt that that would be excusable under the circumstances and immediately founded a lodge of instruction. The reason being that eliminates some of the required formalities. The two past masters, assisted by brother Sidney Brown, set out to recreate the ritual from memory. At a later date, when this ritual was checked, very few corrections were found to be needed, and it now resides in a museum in England, accompanied by its German inspection stamp, one genuine, one forged, so that they could get it out of the country. While they had the room to conduct the ritual floor work, security precluded the use of gavels, the left forearm being struck instead, and multiple tilers would be used. Again, encoding the material so that anyone walking in isn't going to be able to catch on to what's going on. In September of 42, the entire camp will be moved to Oflag 7B in Eichstätt, Bavaria, where they remained until the end of the war. So let's go to Camp 7B. Upon arrival, they immediately set about finding a suitable room to continue their Masonic activities. After finding the hospital unsuitable, one of the dentists, Brother Greenslade, who was a member of Otago Lodge 7, offered the use of the dental surgery. Thus, their activities continued even though the room was too small to conduct any form of floor work. Over the next 2.5 years, the membership increased so much that they decided to split into 4 lodges to give all members work. 2 worked under the English Constitution, 1 under the Australian, and 1 under the Scottish. Eventually, most of the brethren from the latter were moved to other camps, and the lodge disbanded. Meetings were held on a monthly basis, except for the summer. Covering of the window to conceal their activity would have attracted too much attention at that point. In the period after D-Day, Allied prisoners in all camps became too agitated with the thought of impending freedom to memorize ritual. Understandable after many years of imprisonment, and activities naturally diminished. However, at their last meeting after the Allies crossed the Rhine, the brethren composed and signed a greeting to the Grand Master of the United Grand Lodge of England. It was signed by 43 brethren and read as follows. Greetings to the most worshipful, the Grand Master and brethren of the United Grand Lodge of England, from the undersigned, on their return from a captivity in Oflag 7B, Eichstätt, Bavaria, who, while in Germany, have endeavored to make daily advancement in Masonic knowledge. Unfortunately, they were a little premature, as it was several months before it would eventually reach its intended recipient, most worshipful brother, the Earl of Harwood. Then we have the issue of Stalag 18A and Stalag 383, both in Germany. 18A is in Wolfsburg, Austria. 383 is in Hohenfels, Germany. In early 1942, the brethren incarcerated at Wolfsburg began to organize themselves to form a meeting. And you know how this story goes. We've already been over this. Many of the prisoners have been captured in Greece and Crete, and as a result of their long journey, they were ragged, hungry, and verminous by the time they reached Austria. These are primarily British servicemen, some Greek, in Greece and Crete. Their initial move was to contribute 1 cigarette each to a common fund, which was used to bribe a guard to allow them to meet in a new hut currently being erected. At this meeting, they decided to elect a representative from England, Scotland, Austria, and New Zealand, whose job it was to prove everyone present. Again, this camp is going to be primarily those who were active in Greece and Crete in 1941-42, and so they're primarily Commonwealth. Next, they made contact with one of the camp doctors, who in fact was a Canadian past master serving in the British Army. I should point out, camp doctors are often provided by the POWs. There is a camp doctor, a German camp doctor, but typically the POWs want to go to one of their own. So if they happen to catch a medic, they become a camp doctor. He arranged for the group to meet in a medical inspection room, but after attending the first meeting, excused himself from involvement on the grounds that if any disciplinary action were due to his involvement with the group, it would be those in the camp who needed his service who would suffer the most. In other words, if he's seen, if the Germans catch him in this act, all of the prisoners will suffer. Consequently, the group went on to form a lodge of instruction and write the first degree ritual. At the end of 42, the bulk of the camp was moved to Stalag 383 in Germany. This was a new camp with prisoners of war coming from various parts of Germany, Austria, and Poland, but by early 1943, the Brethren had begun to meet in a storeroom of an old stable, formerly used by a troop of Boy Scouts in the peacetime and thereby dubbed the Scout Den. Attending Brethren signed a register and then each was proved. They placed a chair against the door as the only means of preventing guards from entering had they chosen to do so. This method was adopted for tiling because it was felt that any external person would have attracted too much attention. Each of these camps is run differently. There are often times where the guards really don't care, and there are other camps where it is very, very strict. And you can imagine that. You've all been to different businesses where it's a franchise and you would expect the same thing in each one, but each one runs a little differently. It's the same thing. Same camp, same idea, different leadership, meaning that there are times where they can get away with things and there are times where the Brethren cannot. The volume of sacred law was always opened at the Book of Ruth, although no one ever seemed to know why. As a note, this is rather strange, as the Book of Ruth is primarily the story of Boaz and contains one of our reasons for preparation. It's kind of an interesting one. It doesn't tie into what we usually see open, but it's what they used. And as I said, no one seems to know why, but Brother Allen, in his article, Stalag Masons, does refer to this, and more than likely it's coming from a diary. Business then proceeded in the usual manner, with the treasurer's report being presented in the currency of cigarettes, which were used to purchase tea, sugar, and milk, for after proceedings, or used by two charity stewards for distribution amongst the sick. It sounds strange, but in difficult times, things like cigarettes, alcohol, etc. take on a black market value. And we see this in the camps. We see this amongst the Masons, but amongst other POWs, we see lots of stories about this. The Brethren there represented 12 different constitutions, and many interesting activities aside from ritual practice took place. One memorable one recorded in the minutes was a lecture on the life of Mozart, presented by a Hungarian brother. Often a meeting would end with a substantial toast list, all of course drunken tea from the various personal drinking receptacles that each brother brought to a meeting, and the spreading of any news from home. So you would have these toasts, you would have news from home, there are letters coming in, typically those letters are going to be shared amongst the POWs. One brother had received notice by letter that he had been appointed as steward of his lodge in his absence. Sounds familiar. His brethren, with much ingenuity and scavenging around the camp, fabricated a steward's collar, and he was invested by the master at the next meeting with the same dignity he would have received in his mother lodge. The camp was dispersed at the end of hostilities in 1945 with a membership of 82, an average attendance of 60, and the minute book, accounts, and other relics are held at the Library of the United Grand Lodge of England. It is worthy of note that Brother Carpenter reported the Masonic activities of another group in the same camp, under the name The Chess Club, with membership of 20, mostly from the Grand Lodge of Scotland in Australia. Because of the level of secrecy required for these groups to operate under the noses of their guards, it is possible that neither group actually knew of the other's existence. While Masonic activities existed in various other camps, often on a small scale, the theme remained the same. Brethren would endeavor to make daily advancements in Freemasonry under very trying conditions. Brother Igluden, later Worshipful Brother Lieutenant Colonel Igluden, DSO, summarized his feelings in this manner. The impression left with me as a result of my own experience is very strong as to the beneficial effect which members of the craft must have had on other people, both by example and by individual acts of kindness. Whilst in no way implying that there were not others who set a good example, it was noticeable to me that the Freemasons amongst us behaved in a most exemplary and charitable way, under the circumstances which all too frequently brought out less than praiseworthy traits in human nature. All of this is drawn, or most of this is drawn, from Stalag Masons by Jeff Allen. Let's go to Italy and see what's going on there. There is some evidence that brethren imprisoned in Italian camps were able to identify one another and meet from time to time. In Italy, the camps are going to function a little differently. The Italians aren't really into the German side of the war, even though they fight on the German side into 43, and then they flip sides and get invaded by the Germans, or the northern half gets invaded by the Germans. So it tends to be a little bit looser in terms of the camps. But there is some evidence that brethren imprisoned were able to identify one another, as I said. An informant, Brother B.H. Gordon, recalls that at Viano, there was an active group of Freemasons of about 20 who were able to hold a certain number of meetings in the library of a building formerly used as a priest's rest house. One of the brethren fashioned the regalia and tools, which when not in use were hidden in a cavity behind an overmantel over a fireplace. They may still be hidden there today. This hiding place was easily accessible for disposable regalia in case of an alarm, when, as usual, in prisoner of war camps, the occupants of the room would be found merely reading or engaging in some other quite innocuous pursuit. They would have board games under their chairs, their stories of hand-carved games and paper with tic-tac-toe, etc., all being pulled out from under chairs or under your seat. Literally, you would be sitting on it or elsewhere, just in case someone came in. And this was a drill that was rehearsed many times until it was perfected. The flourishing Lodge of Improvement at Brunswick, which we talked about, to which reference, of course, has been made, had its beginnings first in Italy. The brethren concerned, numbering about 40, had originally met in Chieti, Italy, whence they were transferred after the fall of Mussolini. At the time of their removal from Italy, they had been rehearsing the opening and closing ceremonies and initiation, indicating that the time spent in Italy had been properly used. Brother Brown recounts that at Eichstätt, after D-Day, the brethren were unable to concentrate on memorizing the rituals, so that the lectures were given instead. One which he recalls was devoted to Masonic work carried on in prisoner of war camps in Italy, given by a brother who had been imprisoned there. So they're giving lectures, because the brothers are going to be understandably distracted, knowing that freedom is on its way. He told them that, quote, supervision by the enemy authorities had been less severe, and proper working tools had been made, and most meetings had finished up with a festive board, if it could be so called. In other words, they're having a meeting, they're having dinner afterwards, or some kind of snacks, coffee, whatever's available to them. Nothing else is reported of these activities. The strictness of supervision in Italian camps must have varied considerably. The lecture referred to by Brother Brown mentions that it was, quote, less severe. But at Viano, there were constant searches of officers' personal belongings. By the way, different rules for officers and enlisted men in all of the POW camps. Searches would be thorough and made at all times, basically to harass them. It is inconceivable that camp authorities were completely unaware of Masonic activities, as one Italian example illustrates. At Viano, an Italian officer sent a bottle of brandy to a supposedly secret meeting with his best wishes for an enjoyable meeting. Now, this Italian information comes from A.R. Hurwitz, his Craftsmen in Captivity, Masonic Activities of Prisoners of War. So ends the summary of Masonic activity among brethren, prisoners of war in German and Italian hands during the war period. It is necessarily incomplete and does not do justice to the courage of these men. Not just the courage that got them into that position where they went to war on behalf of their country, but also the courage to then stand up as Masons, to work on these things. You could imagine the draw to basically do the minimum possible and just get through the war. But here they're taking on additional responsibilities. They're taking on additional need. This is a need to improve themselves. They're taking themselves and making themselves better even during their time in the camp. Even with all of the risks that are associated, because you could imagine what would happen if the Germans came across a group of them. They might not be put to death. It might not be the same as the Night and Fog prisoners. But at the same time, they would be sent to a more difficult camp. And there are levels of camp that you can be sent to. And they get rougher and rougher. And there are camps which are basically unofficial POW death camps that we're aware of, where you send people and they kind of tend to die on a regular basis. And so their activities are incredibly risky. And so we've seen these different parts of Masonry reacting to the Reich and handling the war. We've seen Masonry in occupied Europe. We've seen Masonry in the camps. We've seen the anti-Masonic exhibitions and the amnesty and what happened in Germany prior to the war. But there are two more parts we have to deal with. In the next part, I want to deal with remembrance. How does the craft come back? What does the craft do to rebuild? And how does it remember those forgotten years in Germany? That will be part of part 5 of Masonry under the Reich. The craft remembers.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org. That's WIMasons.org. Learn more about Freemasonry and access more educational content and further light. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wimasons.org. Once again, that email address is education@wisconsinmasons.wimasons.org. Thank you for listening.